She wasn't supposed to be there. That's what most people in the lecture hall were thinking as the woman in the gray cardigan slipped into a seat at the very back, unnoticed by some, but unmistakably out of place to others. She didn't carry a university laptop, didn't wear the markers of graduate academia, no department tote bag, no ID badge lanyard, no overconfident air of belonging. Just a plain notebook, a white blouse, and a stillness that felt unfamiliar in the buzz of nervous energy that preceded one of the most anticipated symposiums of the semester at Canyon Ridge University. At the front of the room, Professor Elijah Monroe stood at the podium, adjusting his glasses with calculated ease. He was the kind of man who didn't ask for respect. He commanded it by reputation. 30 years in mathematics, head of the department, keynote speaker at international conferences, widely published, relentlessly cited, and just as relentlessly feared. Not because he shouted or belittled, he simply didn't need to. His silence was often louder than most people's words. A single raised eyebrow from Monroe could make a doctoral candidate rethink their thesis. The announcement had gone out weeks ago, an open symposium discussing new approaches to unresolved theoretical problems, particularly those that intersected with modern quantum cryptography. No registration necessary, open to the academic community, the flyer had said. And technically, the woman in the cardigan belonged to the community, just not in the way the room had assumed. When Monroe finally began, the noise cut out instantly. Today's topic, he said, voice sharp, clean, concerns emerging mathematical frameworks in relation to quantum encryption. Specifically, we'll be reviewing aspects of unresolved theoretical models and their computational boundaries. No one dared look bored. He moved with precision through a series of slides, pausing only to emphasize transitions in logic or derivations that to the trained eye seemed effortless. But somewhere in that flurry of variables and proofs, something went unspoken. An assumption tucked in the transformation of a variable, the kind of oversight that only someone obsessively familiar with the boundary conditions might notice. The woman in the back row noticed. Her name was Rebecca Hale. She was 38. She worked night shifts in facility services. 3 years ago, she'd applied for a job that involved cleaning the very floor of the building they now sat in. She'd never expected much from the university except a paycheck and some measure of anonymity. But this symposium had been posted on the bulletin board by the break room, and she had read it, and she had knew instantly, without having to debate it with herself, that she had to attend. While Monroe elaborated on a theory with precise inflection, Rebecca was already scribbling, quietly comparing each logical step to what she'd internalized over years of independent study. She never looked up during the presentations, not even when people began to whisper. 2 graduate students seated a row ahead leaned toward each other. "Isn't that the janitor from Building C?" one muttered. "Probably here for extra credit or some community audit thing," the other replied. "Monroe's going to lose it when he realizes." Rebecca heard them. She always heard that kind of comment. She had learned to absorb it, reroute it. There had been years of it, at gas stations, in libraries, at community college. It didn't hurt anymore. It just sank into her and got converted into something more useful, something fuel-like. She didn't raise her hand during the discussion period. There had been a time when she might have. That time had come and gone years ago, well, maybe in her 20s, before her daughter, before the divorce, before the second job. Now she listened. She studied. She observed the rhythms of power in a room like this and let it pass by her. It wasn't hers to interrupt. But when Monroe finished his section and invited questions from the floor, a long silence followed. Rebecca had planned to stay invisible. She had told herself that before coming in, observe, take notes, leave before anyone notices. But her hand rose before her brain approved the motion. And that was the moment everything shifted. When Monroe saw the hand, he did what he always did when faced with someone he didn't immediately recognize. He scanned the room for cues. When no one else looked her way, he zeroed in. "Yes?" he said, already bored with whatever was about to happen. "I had a question about the transformation you applied in step 4, she began, voice barely above conversational. "Wouldn't that produce inconsistencies if you tested against the boundary constraints in Model G?" The silence was louder than any applause could have been. Heads turned. Monroe froze. His eyes narrowed, not because of the question, but because of the source. When she said her name and department, none. When she said she worked in facilities, something in the room cracked open. There was a beat of hesitation, then an eruption of whispers. Someone laughed softly. Monroe's voice turned sharp, not quite mocking, but close. Fascinating, he said, drawing out the syllables. And you believe there's a flaw in the derivation? Rebecca didn't say yes. She said something softer, a potential complication. But the damage was done. The mood of the room had changed. She had interrupted the uninterruptible. She had stepped out of line, and Monroe wasn't about to let that go unanswered. Monroe adjusted his cufflink with deliberate slowness, a slight tilt of his head the only signal that he was shifting gears. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his reputation did the work for him. Well then, he said, glancing toward the audience, perhaps our guest from facilities would like to demonstrate her insight. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a challenge dressed as civility. He gestured toward the front, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The chalk rested in his hand like a gavel. He offered it out, the motion slow, theatrical. Come forward, Miss Hale. The room exhaled in collective disbelief. Rebecca didn't move at first. The back of her throat felt dry. She knew what this was, a test, a trap, a spectacle. The kind of moment meant to reinforce the line between those who belonged and those who did not. But she also knew something else, something more pressing, more enduring. She was tired. Tired of folding herself small, tired of knowing the answer and pretending she didn't, tired of being invisible to everyone except the people who handed her work orders. So she stood, and the room shifted again. Every step felt like pushing against wind. She reached the board, accepted the chalk, and stared at what Monroe had scrawled across the surface. It was a multivariable differential equation, elegant in construction. Difficult, yes, but not unreachable. Not if you'd done the kind of obsessive midnight on the bathroom floor studying that she had. Not if math had been your only anchor when life collapsed around you. Monroe stepped back, arms folded, letting the room fill with the soft murmurs of anticipation. Students leaned forward. Some whispered to their neighbors, already preparing to dissect her mistakes. Rebecca said nothing. She turned to the board and began to write. Her first step was deliberate, conservative. She mapped out the foundational terms, moving carefully through the early transformation. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to think clearly. Each line that followed was faster, more fluid. The rhythm came back to her like a language she hadn't spoken aloud in years, but had never stopped dreaming in. 3 lines in, the murmurs faded. 4 lines in, the room was silent. By the time she hit the critical point, the part where most undergrads stalled, she had already calculated the simplification in her head. She didn't pause. She didn't ask for permission. She just wrote it. And when she boxed the final answer with a clean arc of chalk, she stepped back. No one moved. Monroe's expression didn't change at first. He approached the board like a man walking into a room he was certain he knew by heart, only to find the furniture rearranged. He read each line. Then again, a third time, he said nothing, but his grip on the eraser tightened slightly. That's correct, he finally admitted, the words brittle in his mouth. A clever solution, though nothing beyond basic calculus. A professor in the second row narrowed her eyes. She was a guest lecturer from Boston, Rebecca would learn later, someone who had published widely on nonlinear systems. She said nothing, but she was watching with unnerving intensity. Monroe turned back to the chalkboard. His posture sharpened. Let's try something more challenging, he said, and then he began to write. This equation was different, denser. The notation veered into the realm of quantum mathematics, the kind of abstract modeling not typically touched outside of doctoral dissertations or high-tier journals. He stepped away, the chalk clacking softly on the ledge. This, he said to the room, is from my current research. It has implications for quantum encryption. I wouldn't expect any familiarity unless you've kept current with the latest publications. He looked at Rebecca. You may return to your seat, of course. No shame in recognizing the limits of self-education. She didn't move. Not because she was defiant, not because she had anything to prove, but because something in the equation caught her attention. It wasn't the whole thing. Just a pattern buried in the third cluster of variables. something she'd seen in an article a few weeks ago, printed off at a public library during her break. She hadn't understood the entire paper, but she remembered the shape of it, the structure. She reached for the chalk again. The laughter this time was less confident, uneasy. Several students shifted in their seats. One muttered, "She's going to crash and burn." But no one stopped her. Monroe didn't stop her. Rebecca began again, slower this time, not because of fear, but because the stakes had changed. She didn't recognize the full structure of the problem, but she trusted the instincts that had carried her through 1,000 late-night sessions of pattern recognition, algorithm deconstruction, and theoretical puzzle solving. She tested a substitution. It collapsed one small section of the equation. She kept going. When she paused, it wasn't because she was lost. It was because she saw the trap ahead, the part designed to dead end. Monroe stepped forward slightly. "A valiant attempt," he said. Rebecca didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the part of the board that wasn't finished yet. The space between two seemingly incompatible transformations. Something there didn't quite fit, or maybe it fit too perfectly, and then she saw it. Not the answer, but the road to the answer. A turn she hadn't considered. She reached up and made one small change. The variables shifted, the path opened, and for the second time that afternoon, the room fell into stunned silence. Monroe didn't speak. His hands hovered near the board as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing, as if resisting the urge to interrupt something he could no longer predict or control. What Rebecca was doing didn't follow the expected trajectory. She was taking an oblique path through the equation, avoiding the standard techniques entirely, peeling back layers with a clarity that felt less like derivation and more like revelation. In the front row, the professor from Boston leaned forward, murmured something to the colleague beside her. A rustle moved through the seats, a soft chorus of shifting papers, and whispered disbelief. The students who had laughed earlier were now silent. Some looked confused. Others leaned in with narrowed eyes, watching not just a solution unfold, but a transformation. Rebecca continued. She didn't rush, didn't second guess. Her focus was absolute, each line built on the last with increasing elegance. She collapsed an expression using a method no one in the room had seen before. Not a shortcut, not a trick, a refinement, something quieter, smarter, something that made the rest of the equation yield. Halfway through, Monroe's expression began to change. He no longer stood with the same upright confidence. He studied her work not like a teacher observing a student, but like a man trying to catch up with a train that had left the station faster than he expected. His silence became brittle, tense. Rebecca paused only once, scanning what she had done, assessing the terrain ahead. There was a knot in the logic, a convergence that resisted the direction she had been taking. She tried one line. It stalled. She tried another. It looped back on itself. She stepped slightly aside from the equation, narrowed her attention to a single transformation near the top. And then she saw it. Not just a solution, but a restructuring. A way to collapse 3 steps into one by changing the dimensional framework. She picked up the chalk again and executed it in a single clean motion. Someone in the second row gasped. "She's using dimensional analysis," the professor from Boston said under her breath, but not quietly. "She just eliminated the quantum variance term." No one replied. They were too stunned to comment, too cautious to guess where this was heading. Monroe's face remained unreadable, but his posture had stiffened. He moved forward, closer to the board, as if proximity might somehow regain control of the moment. Rebecca didn't notice. Or if she did, she didn't care. She was already deep in the final transformation. Her last few lines brought everything together. Terms that had seemed incompatible earlier, now dovetailing with eerie precision. She placed the final value in a small box, underlined it, and stepped away. The room didn't applaud. Not yet. They just stared. The equation was complete. The result stood stark and undeniable across the board. It wasn't just correct. It was breathtakingly efficient. An entire branch of inquiry folded inward on itself, clarified in a few minutes by a woman with no published work, no academic affiliation, no degree beyond community college. The professor from Boston was the first to break the silence. She stood slowly, eyes locked on the board. "That's not just a solution," she said, her voice cutting across the room. "That's an advancement." She turned to the room. This transformation she applied, this isn't in circulation yet, but I've seen a preliminary version. It was published last month in the Journal of Quantum Mathematics as part of a proposed encryption model, the Lu Takahashi method. Her gaze fell on Rebecca. How do you know about it? Rebecca didn't answer right away. The chalk still in her hand felt heavier now, not from strain, but from awareness. This was the moment, the one she'd avoided for years, the one she'd been afraid would expose her, not for being wrong, but for being right in a way the world wouldn't know what to do with. She didn't deflect, didn't apologize. I didn't know it had a name, she said simply. I read something about quantum structures in an article during my break. I didn't memorize it. I just remembered the pattern. Monroe took a step forward, his voice tight. That's impossible. You don't arrive at these concepts casually. They take years of specialized study. But he didn't sound certain. He sounded shaken. The Boston professor ignored him. She walked straight to the board, tracing Rebecca's steps with her finger, her lips moving silently as she verified the logic. She nodded, then turned to Rebecca again. Have you documented any of your other work? Rebecca's eyes flicked down for the first time. I have notebooks, she said, just personal ones. I write in them when I can't sleep. Monroe's eyes narrowed. What kind of mathematics? Number theory, she said. Some prime factorization algorithms. Mostly things I was curious about. A wave of reaction moved through the professors seated in the front row. A few of them exchanged looks, nodding almost imperceptibly. One of them, an older man with a stack of journals in his lap, stood up and pulled out his phone. Another started scribbling notes on a folder. A third leaned toward the dean sitting on the aisle, whispering urgently. Monroe didn't say anything. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The applause didn't come in a wave. It started slowly. A single student stood and clapped, then another, then five, then the entire room. A rising sound that swallowed the lecture hall and replaced the silence with something new. Not validation, not praise, recognition. The applause echoed longer than anyone expected. It had no script, no cue, no institutional blessing. It wasn't formal. It wasn't even appropriate, not by academic standards. But it was real. Loud, clumsy, full of disbelief and something else. Relief, maybe. Relief that someone had broken through the thick wall of predictability that usually wrapped itself around these events. And there she stood. Not a guest speaker, not a visiting scholar. A woman who cleaned the floors just hours before entering that very room. Rebecca stood still, surrounded by a sound she'd never expected to hear. When it finally faded, the questions began. Not from students, but from faculty. They circled her, asked where she had learned, what she had studied, what else she had written. A dozen hands reaching for clarity, for context, for any explanation that might help them fit her into a structure they understood. But there was no structure. There was just her, and a life. Rebecca answered with quiet candor. No, she had never enrolled in formal mathematics beyond community college. Yes, she had studied obsessively on her own. No, she had never shared her work. She didn't think anyone would take it seriously. She had a daughter. She needed stable work. She needed health insurance. Ideas didn't pay for groceries. Curiosity didn't cover rent. She had kept her notebooks to herself, scribbled formulas in the margins of utility bills, written theorems between night shifts. Not because she was hiding, because she thought no one would care. Or worse, that they would care just enough to laugh. But the tone in the room had shifted. The laughter was gone. Professor Monroe, once the undisputed center of every symposium, now stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't moved during the questions. He hadn't congratulated her. Hadn't corrected her either. He watched as Dr. Cassandra Ayers, the guest from Boston, stood beside Rebecca like an anchor. It wasn't showmanship. It was something closer to allegiance. Cassandra turned to Rebecca and asked to see the notebooks. Not someday, not when convenient. Now, today, if possible. Rebecca hesitated, caught between two versions of herself, the one that folded chairs and emptied bins, and the one that had just collapsed a three-tier encryption equation in front of a dozen published mathematicians. I'll bring them tomorrow, she said. That was when Monroe finally spoke. I'll review them, he said. His voice held back the edge that had cracked earlier. Personally. Cassandra's gaze cut toward him like a line of symmetry. We'll review them, she said. slow and firm, her emphasis unmistakable. Monroe didn't respond. Behind them, the lecture hall had thinned slightly. Some students had returned to their seats, others still lingered, unsure whether they had witnessed a moment of triumph or disruption. It felt like both. Rebecca stepped toward her bag. Her phone buzzed. 5 missed calls from the babysitter. She slipped it into her pocket. Real life wasn't suspended just because this one had cracked open. It never was. That was the math she understood best. Even as heads turned and questions circled, time kept moving forward. Rent would still be due. Groceries still needed buying. Her daughter still needed her. She was almost at the door when a voice called softly behind her. "Miss Hale?" It was a student, early 20s maybe, uncertain posture, engineering department sweatshirt, someone who had stayed quiet the entire time. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for showing that where you start doesn't have to decide what you know." Rebecca paused. The girl wasn't asking for advice. She was offering something, a bridge, a gesture of solidarity between two people who didn't grow up knowing they'd have access to places like this, who had learned to enter them quietly, sit at the back, and hope not to be noticed. Until today. Rebecca nodded once. She didn't speak. Outside, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the sidewalk in amber light. The wind shifted. The crowd inside was still buzzing, still rearranging its assumptions. But out here, things were quieter, colder, more certain. She walked down the stairs with purpose. Her notebooks were waiting, dozens of them, years of unshared insight, pages filled by a woman who believed she was invisible. Not anymore. Tomorrow, they would ask for more. Tomorrow, they would evaluate, question, dissect. But tonight, Rebecca Hale walked home under the open sky with nothing to explain. She had written herself into the conversation, and for once, no one could erase her. 6 months later, Rebecca stood at the front of a small classroom, marker in hand, whiteboard already half filled with equations. The air was different here, focused, alive. This wasn't a grand lecture hall or a room filled with people waiting to test her. These were undergraduates, most of them young, most of them unsure, most of them not yet realizing what they were capable of. But Rebecca saw them clearly, saw in their questions and hesitations the same quiet longing she once carried around like a secret, an ache to be seen, to be heard, to be counted. She had come a long way from that symposium. After the lecture that day, things had moved quickly, faster than she could have imagined, faster than she was ready for. Dr. Emery had pushed through an emergency fellowship application, citing exceptional aptitude and non-traditional pathway. MIT's board had approved it within weeks. Rebecca didn't even get the chance to process the weight of the offer. By the time the formal paperwork landed in her mailbox, her notebooks were already being cited by 3 different academic teams. Her first paper had been accepted 3 months in. Her second, co-authored with a cryptography researcher in Boston, came shortly after. Her name, Rebecca Hale, was now listed on databases she'd only ever browsed before from public library terminals. And people were emailing her. Real mathematicians, journal editors, researchers asking for her input. But none of that matched the strangeness of returning to Canyon Ridge, not as a custodian, but as a visiting lecturer. It was Monroe, ironically, who made the call. There had been some friction at first, faculty meetings, debates about precedent, questions about qualifications, but her work spoke for itself. And when Monroe found himself outvoted more than once by younger, more forward-thinking colleagues, he adapted, slowly, grudgingly, but enough. He even nodded at her in the hallway now. Rebecca never sought his approval, but she didn't resent him anymore either. He was just a man built by a system that taught him how to measure worth in very narrow increments. She wasn't here to dismantle him. She was here to make sure students like hers didn't think those were the only units that mattered. Her daughter, Lily, had transferred into the university a few weeks after Rebecca started teaching. Full scholarship, declared major in applied mathematics. She hadn't asked for help on her application, hadn't needed it. When the acceptance came, she slid the letter across the table with a look that said she wasn't surprised, just relieved that maybe finally she didn't have to fight the world alone. Now Rebecca taught 2 classes a week, continued her research remotely, and spent late nights sketching out theories by hand the same way she always had. She hadn't changed who she was. She had simply stopped hiding it. That afternoon in the classroom, one of her students raised a hand. A girl with a nervous voice and sharp eyes. Rebecca called on her without hesitation, even before she finished raising her arm. The question was cautious, but layered. It danced around the edges of the problem on the board, hinting at uncertainty but also curiosity. Rebecca nodded, rewrote a portion of the equation, and offered a new path forward. She saw the understanding bloom in the girl's face, and with it, something else. Possibility. After class, as students packed up, a few lingered to ask more questions. One wanted to know about internship opportunities in computational theory. Another asked if Rebecca would be willing to review a proposal for a student-led research group. Rebecca said yes to both. She always did. Not because she had time, she didn't, but because the math would wait. The kids couldn't. As the last student left, Rebecca erased the board slowly, not because she was stalling, but because she was thinking about what came next. Her third paper was almost ready. It involved a new encryption model that had already drawn the attention of a defense research institute. There were offers on the table, teaching positions, speaking engagements, funding. But none of it excited her as much as the idea of going back through her oldest notebooks and reworking some of the messier problems she'd abandoned years ago. She had more to say, and for the first time in her life, people were listening. On her way out, she stopped by the departmental lounge to grab a coffee. Monroe was there talking to another professor. When he saw her, he didn't look away. Instead, he gave her a small nod, not of concession, not of defeat, but of recognition. It was enough. Back at her office, a small space carved out from what used to be a storage closet, Rebecca sat at her desk and pulled out her notes. She liked it here. The desk wasn't big, the light wasn't great, and the chair creaked. But the room was hers. She had earned it not by demanding it, but by refusing to disappear. Later that night, Lily came by with takeout. They sat on the floor, eating Thai food out of cartons, talking about nonlinear regression models and Netflix recommendations in the same breath. At some point, Lily looked up and said, "You know, it still doesn't feel real." Rebecca smiled and said, "It isn't. Not yet, but we're getting close." Outside, the campus lights blinked on, one by one, in the growing dark. And inside that tiny office, surrounded by scribbled equations and cold noodles, the woman who had once been invisible sat with her daughter, rewriting the future, one variable at a time. Rebecca wasn't chasing anything anymore. Not validation, not prestige, not even approval. What she had now was agency, something quieter, less celebrated, but far more powerful. Her days moved with rhythm. Lectures, office hours, late-night research, emails she still sometimes read twice to make sure they were real. But she hadn't forgotten where she started, or how quickly the world could forget what it didn't expect to see. It was a Thursday afternoon when her inbox pinged with an unexpected message. The subject line read, "Fellowship Application Inquiry, Priority Review." The sender was the Office of Academic Development at MIT. Rebecca opened the email slowly. It was brief, formal, and oddly specific. The committee was preparing materials for a new cohort of accelerated fellows and wanted to include her name, pending her consent, as an exemplar of non-traditional academic advancement. They asked for a short bio and a brief reflection on her journey. Nothing fancy, they wrote, just a few paragraphs. She read it 3 times before closing the window. That night, she didn't open a notebook. She didn't read research papers. She sat in her kitchen, lights off except for the glow of the fridge. She thought about the early years of pushing a mop cart through silent corridors while math theorems bounced around in her head, unresolved and restless. She remembered the nights Lily slept beside her on a folded blanket because the electricity had been shut off again. She remembered teaching herself Laplace transforms by flashlight. No one had seen those moments, but they were the scaffolding of everything. She didn't write the bio that night. She didn't need to rush. The next morning, as she walked across campus, a graduate student stopped her in front of the library. "Are you Rebecca Hale?" he asked, eyes wide, slightly breathless. "I read your paper on lattice-based encryption. It changed the way I think about projection theory." Rebecca thanked him, not out of modesty, but because it still startled her. Not the recognition, but the fact that it was always framed around the work. Not her credentials, not her title, just the work. At her office, there was another email waiting, this one from the dean. A position had opened for a faculty advisor on a cross-disciplinary research initiative, applied mathematics, computer science, and ethics in artificial intelligence. We believe your perspective would offer something rare, he wrote, something grounded. Rebecca closed the email, leaned back in her chair. Her first instinct was to decline, not because she didn't want to do it, but because there was still a small voice in her that sometimes whispered, "They'll figure it out. They'll realize you're just the woman who used to buff the floors." But that voice was quieter now. She replied yes. That weekend, she sat with Lily at a local diner, both of them hunched over laptops. Lily was applying for a summer internship in San Francisco. She was working on her personal statement, biting her lip and deleting sentences. Rebecca offered to read it. It was short, honest, full of sharp edges, and earned hope. The final line stayed with her all night. "My mother didn't teach me mathematics. She showed me what happens when you don't let anyone else define what you're allowed to understand." Rebecca didn't say anything after reading it, just handed the laptop back and ordered another coffee. The following week, during her seminar on theoretical modeling, a student lingered after class. She had barely spoken all semester, always sitting at the edge of the room. Today, she waited until the room had emptied out. "I've been thinking about switching majors," she said, "but I'm scared. No one in my family has done anything like this. I just don't want to waste time on something I might never be good at." Rebecca didn't launch into a pep talk. She didn't point to her published papers or titles. She told the student about the time she'd nearly thrown out her notebooks after a 12-hour shift because she thought no one would ever read them. "But I didn't," she said. "I kept writing." The student nodded. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just said thank you and walked out. Rebecca stood alone in the quiet room, the whiteboard still marked with symbols. She didn't erase them. She left them there, unfinished, waiting. That night, she finally opened the draft for her fellowship reflection. She didn't write about transformation or triumph. She wrote about silence. She wrote about the years no one had watched, about the basement closet where she'd written a proof on the inside wall with a pencil stub, about the library computer that limited sessions to 20 minutes, about the stack of used textbooks she'd bought one at a time from thrift stores. She ended with one line: "The question you're afraid to ask might be the one that proves you belong." She hit send and closed her laptop. Outside it had started to rain, a quiet, steady kind of rain, the kind that didn't interrupt anything, the kind that just asked you to keep going. The morning of the awards ceremony arrived without fanfare. Rebecca hadn't told many people, a few colleagues, her daughter, the department assistant who insisted on printing her nameplate in gold foil. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about the moment itself, the quiet acknowledgement that she had crossed an invisible threshold no one had thought she'd even approach. The lecture hall was unfamiliar, sleek, modern, filled with people who'd never mopped a floor or clipped coupons between shifts. As she walked through the foyer, she passed a digital display cycling through profiles of honorees. Her face flashed on screen between two tenured professors. Her title read, "Independent Theorist turned Academic Fellow." She didn't pause. She didn't flinch. Inside, the chairs filled quickly. Dr. Emery sat in the front row, flanked by colleagues from Boston, a few from MIT, and one visiting from the Netherlands who had cited Rebecca's second paper in a recent publication. Monroe was there too, further back, silent, observant, his hands folded. When her name was called, she stood. The applause was warm, but she barely heard it. Not from nerves, those days were long gone, but because her mind was elsewhere. On Lily, sitting a few rows behind, dressed in the same cardigan Rebecca used to wear, sleeves rolled up like armor. On her notebooks at home, now scanned, archived, and shelved in the university library under special collections. On the memory of a younger version of herself, sitting in a janitor's closet, balancing a thermos on a crate while solving differential equations by flashlight. She accepted the award without a speech. That was the agreement. The recognition wasn't for performance. It was for persistence. After the ceremony, people gathered in the reception hall. There were canapes and clinking glasses and conversations threaded with grant money, lab hours, and collaborative prospects. Rebecca moved through the room like someone trying not to disturb the furniture. She stopped only when a thin man in a worn blazer approached her. "I'm not a mathematician," he said quickly, almost apologetically. "I teach literature, but I read your paper on cryptographic recursion. I didn't understand most of it, but I couldn't stop reading." Rebecca smiled. "That's more than enough," she said. He nodded and moved on. The room began to thin. A few professors cornered her near the door, asking about a possible keynote in the fall. Another asked if she'd consider mentoring students outside her discipline. "Your trajectory, it breaks the model, in a good way." She promised to think about it. Outside, Lily waited on a bench under a canopy of light. When Rebecca joined her, they didn't talk at first. Just sat in the hush between events, watching students pass by with backpacks and earbuds and hurried steps. "You ever think it would go this far?" Lily asked eventually. Rebecca didn't answer right away. She thought of all the versions of herself that never made it into the spotlight. The tired version, the invisible version, the one that folded laundry in silence while numbers rearranged themselves behind her eyes, the version that hadn't known she was allowed to be more. "No," she said at last, "but I never stopped walking." They stayed there until the building emptied out. That night, back home, Rebecca opened a new notebook. The first page was clean, uncreased. She didn't feel the same urgency she once had. No desperation to prove anything, no need to outpace her past, but she still felt the pull, the quiet ache that lived in numbers, the hum beneath the chaos. She began to write again, not because she had something to publish, but because the questions hadn't stopped coming. One day, maybe, another woman would sit where she once did, at the back of a room, wondering if anyone like her had ever solved something that mattered, wondering if she was foolish for thinking she could. Rebecca wanted there to be proof waiting for her, not a plaque, not an award, just the math, the truth of the work. In the weeks that followed, she returned to her teaching. She started a small study group for students who didn't quite fit in, first gens, older learners, those balancing work and school. She read their questions carefully. She never rushed their answers. She also finished her third paper. It focused on anomalous patterns in quantum lattice structures and quietly corrected a widely circulated error in a prominent journal. She submitted it under her own name, with no fanfare, no co-author. It was accepted within 10 days. Her office door remained open. Sometimes when no one came in, she would still pick up her chalk and fill the board with problems that hadn't been solved yet. Not to show off, just to see what might emerge. Because the truth was simple. Genius didn't always look like genius. It didn't wear tweed or hold degrees or speak with perfect diction. Sometimes it smelled faintly of bleach and coffee. Sometimes it worked night shifts. Sometimes it sat quietly in the back of the room, watching everything, waiting for a moment it wasn't sure would ever come. And when it did come, it didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like choice. One small, defiant choice to raise a hand, to ask the question, to not sit back down. And maybe that's the only real breakthrough any of us ever get. Not the answer, but the courage to be seen asking. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We're deeply grateful for your attention and presence. Stories like this remind us that brilliance can come from the most unexpected places, and that what often holds people back isn't a lack of talent, but a lack of recognition. One quiet voice, one raised hand, one act of courage, these can shift everything. If this story resonated with you or made you pause and reflect, we'd love to hear from you. To support our channel, all it takes is a simple like. It means more than you think. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and how this story made you feel. We love knowing how far our stories travel, and your reflections truly inspire us to keep sharing more. And don't forget to subscribe. It helps us continue to bring powerful, real stories to people everywhere. Until next time, thank you for being here with us.